Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be reading and discussing Part 4 of Chapter 2 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Laṅkāvatāra Sūtra. If you remember, the title translates roughly to Discourse of the Descent into Lanka. The text recounts Shakyamuni giving the teaching to a bodhisattva named Mahamati, which translates to Great Wisdom, as they bring the Dharma to the mythical land of Lanka, often interpreted as modern-day Sri Lanka. This area is ruled by Ravana, the king of the Rakshasas. The Lankavatara discusses numerous Mahāyāna concepts, such as Yogācāra mind-only doctrine, and the three natures, the Alaya Vijnana, Gotra theory, Buddha nature, the luminous mind, emptiness, and even vegetarianism. In this section, Mahamati and the Buddha discuss the empowerment of bodhisattvas by Buddhas, the nature of language, and non-duality in depth. We hope you enjoy. Further, Mahamati, there are two kinds of characteristic signs of self-nature. What are these two kinds? They are the attachment to words as having self-nature, and the attachment to objects as having self-nature. The attachment to words as having self-nature, Mahamati, takes place owing to one's clinging to the habit energy of words and false imaginings since beginningless time. And the attachment to objects as having self-nature, Mahamati, takes place from not knowing that the external world is no more than self-mind. Further, Mahamati, there are two kinds of the sustaining power which issues from the Tathagatas, who are arhats and fully enlightened ones, and sustained by this power, the bodhisattvas would prostrate themselves at their feet and ask them questions. What is this twofold power that sustains the bodhisattvas? The one is the power by which they are sustained to go through the samadhis and samapatis, while the other is the power whereby the Buddhas manifest themselves in person before the bodhisattvas and baptize them with their own hands. Then, Mahamati, sustained by the power of the Buddhas, the bodhisattva mahasattvas, at their first stage, will attain the bodhisattva samadhi, known as the light of Mahāyāna, which belongs to the bodhisattva mahasattvas. They will immediately see the Tathagatas, arhats, fully enlightened ones, appearing before them personally, who come from all the different abodes in the 10 quarters of the world, and who now, facing the bodhisattvas, will impart to them their sustaining power displayed by the body, mouth, and words. Mahamati, as is the case with Vajragarbha, the bodhisattva mahasattva, and with other bodhisattva mahasattvas who are in possession of similar character and virtue, so Mahamati, with the bodhisattva mahasattvas at the first stage, they will attain the Tathagata's power sustaining them in their samadhis and samapatis. By virtue of their stock and merit accumulated for 100,000 kalpas, they will, successively going up the stages and getting thoroughly acquainted with what they should do and should not do, finally reach the stage of bodhisattvahood called Dharma Mega. Here, the bodhisattva mahasattva finds himself seated on a throne in the lotus palace, and surrounded by the bodhisattva mahasattvas of similar class, a tiara decorated and ornamented with all kinds of precious stones is on his head, and his body shines brightly like the moon in the yellowish gold color of the kampaka flower. The Buddhas now come from their worlds in the 10 quarters, and with their lotus-like hands sprinkle the forehead of the bodhisattva mahasattva who is seated on the throne in the lotus palace. The Buddhas thus give him a baptism personally by hand, as when a great king invested with supreme authority baptizes his crown prince. This bodhisattva and these bodhisattvas are said to be sustained by the Buddha's power, being thus baptized by their hands. Mahamati, this is the twofold sustaining power imparted to the bodhisattva mahasattvas, who, sustained by this twofold sustaining power, personally come into the presence of all the Buddhas. In no other way are the Tathagatas, arhats, fully enlightened ones, to be interviewed. Further, Mahamati, whatever samadhis, psychic faculties, and teachings are exhibited by the bodhisattva mahasattvas, they are sustained by the twofold sustaining power of all the Buddhas. If, Mahamati, the bodhisattva mahasattvas show their eloquence without the Buddha's sustaining power, the ignorant and simple-minded will also show their eloquence. But the latter do not. Why? Because of the sustaining power, on the one hand, and its absence, on the other. Where the Tathagatas enter with their sustaining power, there will be music not only in various musical instruments and vessels, but also even in grass, shrubs, trees, and mountains. Mahamati, yes, in towns, indeed, palaces, houses, and royal abodes. How much more those endowed with sentiency? The mute, blind, and deaf will be cured of their deficiencies, Mahamati, and they will enjoy their emancipation. Such, Mahamati, is the great extraordinary virtue of the sustaining power imparted by the Tathagatas. Further, Mahamati said, "Why is it, Blessed One, that when the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas are established in the Samadhis and Samapatis, and when they are baptized at the most exalted stage, the Tathagatas, Arhats, fully enlightened ones, bestow their sustaining power on them?" Replied the Blessed One, "It is in order to make them avoid the evil ones, karma and passions, to keep them away from the jhana and stage of the Shravakahood, to have them realize the stage of Tathagatahood, and to make them grow in the truth and experience already attained. For this reason, Mahamati, the Tathagatas, Arhats, fully enlightened ones, sustain with their power the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas. If they were not thus sustained, Mahamati, they would fall into the way of thinking and feeling as cherished by the wrong philosophers, Shravakas, or evil ones, and would not attain the highest enlightenment. For this reason, the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas are upheld by the Tathagatas, Arhats, fully enlightened ones. Thus it is said, the sustaining power is purified by the Buddha's vows, in the baptism, samadhis, etc., from the 1st to the 10th stage. The Bodhisattvas are in the embrace of the Buddhas. At that time again, Mahamati the Bodhisattva said thus to the Blessed One, "The chain of origination as told by the Blessed One depends on a cause producing an effect, and that is not a theory established on the principle of a self-originating substance. The philosophers also proclaim a causal origination when they say that all things rise conditioned by a supreme spirit, Ishvara, a personal soul, time, or atom. How is it that the rise of all things is explained by the Blessed One in another terminology bearing on causation, but in its meaning not different? Blessed One, the philosophers explain birth from being and non-being, while according to the Blessed One, all things coming into existence from nothingness pass away by causation. That is to say, the Blessed One has ignorance from which there arises mental conformation until we reach old age and death. This teaching as explained by the Blessed One is the doctrine of no causation, and not that of causation. According to the Blessed One, that being so, this is. If this is simultaneous conditionality and not successive mutuality, it is not right. There, Blessed One, the philosopher's teaching excels, and not thine. Why? The cause assumed by the philosophers is not dependent upon the chain of origination and produces effects. But, Blessed One, thy cause has reference to its effect, and the effect to its cause. And thus, there is an interconnection of causal links, and from this mutuality follows the fault of non-finality. When people talk about that being so this is, there is a state of causelessness. Replied the Blessed One, "Not so, Mahamati. Mine is not a causeless theory of causation, which results in an endless interconnection of causes and conditions. I speak of that being so this is, because of my seeing into the nature of the external world, which is nothing but self-mind, and because of its unreality of grasped object and grasping subject. However, Mahamati, when people clinging to the notion of grasped and grasping fail to understand the world as something seen of mind itself, and Mahamati, by them the fault is committed as they recognize the external world as real, with its beings and non-beings, but not by my theory of causation." Further, Mahamati said, "Blessed One, is it not because of the reality of words that all things are? If not for words, Blessed One, there will be no rising of things. Hence, Blessed One, the existence of all things is by reason of the reality of words." Said the Blessed One, "Even when there are no corresponding objects, there are words, Mahamati. For instance, the hare's horns, the tortoise's hair, a barren woman's child, etc. They are not at all visible in the world, but the words are. Mahamati, they are neither entities nor non-entities, but expressed in words. If, Mahamati, you say that because of the reality of words, the objects are, this talk lacks in sense. Words are not known in all the Buddha lands. Words, Mahamati, are an artificial creation. In some Buddha lands, ideas are indicated by looking steadily, in others by gestures, and still others by a frown, by the movement of the eyes, by laughing, by yawning, or by the clearing of the throat, or by recollection, or by trembling. Mahamati, for instance, in the worlds of the steady looking and in those of exquisite odors, and in the Buddha lands of Samantabhadra the Tathagata, Arhat, fully enlightened one, the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, by steadily looking without a wink, attain the recognition of all things as unborn, and also various most excellent samadhis. For this reason, Mahamati, the validity of all things has nothing to do with the reality of words. It is observed, Mahamati, even in this world, that in the kingdom of such special beings as ants, bees, etc., they carry on their work without words. Thus it is said, as space, the hare's horns, and a barren woman's child are non-entities except as expressed in words, so is this existence imagined. When causes and conditions are in combination, the ignorant imagine the birth of this world. As they fail to understand this reason, they wander about in the triple world, which is their dwelling. At that time, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, again said this to the Blessed One. Blessed One, where dost thou pronounce sound to be eternal? The Blessed One replied, according to error, Mahamati, since even to the wise there is this error, only that they are free from perversion. Mahamati, it is like the unwitted in the world who conceive a perverted idea regarding a mirage, a firebrand wheel, a hairnet, the city of the Gandharvas, Maya, a dream, a reflected image, and an Akshapurusha. But with the knowing it is not so, though it does not mean that those illusions do not appear to them. When, Mahamati, there is this error, diversities of forms are seen, though to this error the idea of impermanence is inapplicable. Why? Because it cannot be characterized with the ideas of being and non-being. Again, Mahamati, how are the ideas of being and non-being inapplicable to this error? Because all the ignorant take in varieties of situations, like the waves of the ocean and the waters of the Ganges, which are not seen by the pretas, but seen by others. For this reason, Mahamati, the error existence, or this world of illusion, is not. But as this water is manifest to other people, it is not a non-existence either. Thus, to the wise, the error is neither a perversion nor a non-perversion. And for this reason, Mahamati, the error in itself is characterized with permanency, having the nature of non-distinction, as far as its own appearance is concerned. Mahamati, being discriminated as regards its diversified individual signs, the error is perceived as differentiated. Thus, the error, as far as its own nature is concerned, is characterized with permanency. Again, Mahamati, how is the error to be considered reality? Mahamati, for this reason, that as regards this error, the wise cherish neither a perverted knowledge nor an unperverted knowledge. It is such as it is, and not otherwise. In case, Mahamati, the wise should cherish any thought whatever in this error, it goes contrary to the reality attainable by noble wisdom. If there is anything at all here, it is the prattling of the ignorant, it is not the talk of the wise. Again, when the error is discriminated according to a perverted and an unperverted view, it gives rise to two classes of family, one of which is the family of the wise, and the other the family of the ignorant and the simple-minded. Now, Mahamati, the family of the wise is divisible into three kinds, that is, the Shravakas, the Pratyekabuddhas, and the Buddhas. Mahamati, how does the Shravakayana family rise from the discrimination whereby the ignorant conceive the error? Mahamati, there is the rise of the Shravakayana family, where the attachment to the notions of individuality and generality is kept up. This is the way, Mahamati. This error gives rise to the Shravakayana family. Mahamati, how does the Pratyekabuddhayana family rise as the error is discriminated? Mahamati, when in this error the attachment to the notions of individuality and generality leads one to a retirement from social life, there rises the Pratyekabuddhayana family. Mahamati, how is there the rise of the Buddhayana family when this error is discriminated by the intelligent? Mahamati, when the world is understood to be nothing but mind itself, the existence and non-existence of external objects ceases to be discriminated, and there is the rise of the Buddhayana family. Mahamati, this is the family, that is what is meant by the family. Again, Mahamati, when the error is discriminated by the ignorant, there is the manifestation of varieties of objects which calls forth the assertion on their part that this is so and not otherwise, whence rises the family of the transmigration vehicle. For this reason, Mahamati, the error is discriminated by the ignorant as characterized by multitudinousness, and this error is neither a reality nor an unreality. Thus, Mahamati, this error being discriminated by the wise, turns into tatata, or suchness, with them, by virtue of a revulsion which takes place in them concerning the citta, manas, manovijnana, false reasoning, habit energy, the three svabhavas, and the five dharmas. Thus, Mahamati, there is this statement that tatata is mind emancipated. Mahamati, the meaning of this statement is here thus clearly expressed by me, that is, by the discarding of discrimination is meant the abandonment of all discriminations. So much for this statement. Mahamati said, Blessed One, is the error an entity or not? The Blessed One replied, It is like Maya, Mahamati. The error has no character in it making for attachment. If, Mahamati, the error had any character in it making for attachment, no liberation would be possible from the attachment to existence. The chain of origination would be understood in the sense of creation as held by the philosophers. Mahamati said, Blessed One, if the error is like Maya, it will thereby be the cause of another error. The Blessed One said, No, Mahamati, Maya cannot be the cause of the error, because of its incapability of producing evils and faults. And thus, Mahamati, Maya does not give rise to evil thoughts and faults. Again, Mahamati, Maya has no discrimination of itself. It rises when invoked by the magical charm of a certain person. It has in itself no habit energy of evil thoughts and faults that, issuing from self-discrimination, affect it. Therefore, there are no faults in it. This is only due to the confused view fondly cherished by the ignorant regarding mind, and the wise having nothing to do with it. So it is said, The wise do not see the error, nor is there any truth in its midst. If truth is in its midst, the error would be truth. If there is the rising of individual forms apart from all error, this will indeed be error. The defiled is like darkness. Further, Mahamati, Maya is not an unreality, because it has the appearance of reality, and all things have the nature of Maya. Said Mahamati, Is it, Blessed One, that all things are like Maya because Maya is something imagined and clung to as having multitudinousness of individual forms? Or is it due to the incorrect imagining of individual forms? If all things have the likeness of Maya because Maya is something imagined and clung to as having multitudinousness of individual forms, then see, Blessed One, things are not like Maya. Why? Because forms are seen in the multitudinous of individual signs, not without due causes. If they ever appear without due causes, assuming the multitudinousness of individual signs and shapes, then they would be like Maya. For this reason, Blessed One, that things are like Maya is not because they, i.e. all things and Maya, are both alike in being imagined and clung to as having multitudinousness of individual signs. Said the Blessed One, It is not, Mahamati, that all things are Maya because they are both alike in being imagined and clung to as having multitudinousness of individual signs, but that all things are like Maya because they are unreal and like a lightning flash which is seen as quickly disappearing. Mahamati, a lightning appears and disappears in quick succession as is manifest to the ignorant. In the same way, Mahamati, all things assume individuality and generality according to the discrimination of the mind itself. When the state of imagelessness is recognized, objects which are imagined and clung to as in possession of individual signs cease to assert themselves. Thus it is said, Maya is not without reality because it has something resembling it. The reality of all things is talked of in a similar manner. They are unreal like a lightning flash appearing and disappearing quickly, and therefore they are regarded as resembling Maya. Further, Mahamati said, Now according to the Blessed One, all things are unborn and resemble Maya. But, Blessed One, is there not the fault of contradiction between the previous statement and the later one? It is asserted by thee that all things are unborn is due to their having the nature of Maya. The Blessed One replied, Mahamati, when all things are asserted to be unborn because of their having the nature of Maya, there is no fault of contradiction between my previous statement and my later one. Why? Because birth is no birth. When it is recognized that the world that presents itself before us is no more than mind itself. And as to all external objects of which we state that they are or are not, they are to be seen as non-existent and unborn. And thus, Mahamati, there is here no fault of contradiction between my previous statement and my later one. But, Mahamati, in order to cast aside the philosopher's thesis on birth by causation, it is asserted that all things are like Maya and unborn. Mahamati, the philosophers, who are the gathering of the deluded, foster the notion of deriving the birth of all things from that of being and non-being, and fail to regard it as caused by the attachment to the multitudinousness which arises from the discrimination of the mind itself. Mahamati, no fear rises in me by making this statement. In this light, Mahamati, the term unborn is to be understood. Again, Mahamati, the teaching that all things exist is given in order to admit transmigration, to check nihilism, which says nothing is, and to make my disciples accept the doctrine that asserts the reality of karma in various forms, and birth in the various worlds, For by admitting the terminology of existence, we admit transmigration. Mahamati, the teaching that all things are characterized with the self-nature of Maya, is meant to make the ignorant and simple-minded cast aside the idea of self-nature in anything, as they cherish the thoughts characterized with error, as they do not clearly grasp the meaning of the world which is no more than the mind itself. They imagine and cling to causation, work, birth, and individual signs. In order to check this, I teach that all things are characterized in their self-nature with the nature of Maya and a dream. Attached to erroneous thoughts, they contradict both themselves and others by not seeing all things as they really and truly are. Mahamati, to see all things as they really and truly are, means to realize that there is nothing to be seen but mind itself. So it is said, in the theory of no birth, causation is not accepted as is maintained by the ignorant. Where existence is accepted, transmigration prevails. Seeing that all things are like Maya, etc., one does not discriminate individual signs. Further, Mahamati will explain the characteristics of name body, the sentence body, and the syllable body. For when name body, sentence body, and syllable body are well understood, the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, conformable to the signification of a sentence and a syllable, will quickly realize supreme enlightenment and thereby awaken all beings to it. Mahamati, by name body is meant the object depending on which a name obtains. The body is this object. In another sense, the body means substance, or sharira. Mahamati, this is the body of a name. By the body of a sentence is meant what it signifies, the real object, determining its sense definitely. In another sense, it completes its reference. Mahamati, this is my teaching as regards the sentence body. By the syllable body is meant that by which names and sentences are indicated. It is a symbol, a sign. In another sense, it is something indicated. Again, Mahamati, the sentence body means the completion of the meaning expressed in the sentence. Again, Mahamati, the name, or a letter, means each separate letter distinguished as to its self-nature from A to Ha. Again, Mahamati, a syllable is short, long, or lengthy. Again, Mahamati, regarding the sentence body, the idea of it is obtained from the footprints left on the road by elephants, horses, people, deer, cattle, cow, buffaloes, goats, rams, etc. Again, Mahamati, names and syllables belong to the four skandhas, which, being formless, are indicated by names. Thus are names made. By means of the differently characterized names, there are syllables. Thus are syllables made. This, Mahamati, is the meaning of the body of a name, a sentence, and a syllable. You should endeavor to have a thorough understanding of these terms. It is thus said, because of the distinction between name, sentence, and syllable, the ignorant, the dull-witted, stick to them like the elephant in deep mud. Further, Mahamati, in the time to come, those wrong-headed ones who are inclined to false speculations owing to their deficiency of knowledge concerning truth and cause may be asked by the wise, regarding that which is liberated from the dualistic conceptions of things such as oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, and thus asked may answer saying, it is no question, it is not at all properly put. That is to say, the question, are form, etc., and transiency to be considered one or different? In the same way, nirvana and the skandhas, indices and indicated, qualities and qualified, realities and the elements, seen and seeing, dust and atoms, knowledge and the yogins, are these to be considered one or different? Such questions concerning the various aspects of existence lead successively from one thing to another without end, and those who are asked about these unexplainable questions would declare that they were put aside by the Blessed One as impossible to answer. However, these deluded people are unable to realize the meaning of what they heard from the Buddha because of their deficiency of knowledge. The Tathagatas, Arhats, fully enlightened ones, do not explain these things to all beings because of their wish to keep the latter from the fear-inspiring phrases. Mahamati, these inexplicables are not taken up for consideration by the Tathagatas in order to keep the philosophers away from their wrong views and theories. Mahamati, the philosophers may declare thus, what life is, that is the body, or life is one thing, body is another. In these they make inexplicable statements. Mahamati, entirely bewildered by the idea of a creator, the philosophers make an inexplicable statement, but that is not found in my teaching. In my teaching, discrimination does not take place because I teach to stand above grasped and grasping. How could there be any setting aside here? But Mahamati, to those who are addicted to grasped and grasping, as they do not have a thorough understanding of the world which is no more than what is seen of the mind itself, there is something to be set aside as inexplicable. Mahamati, the Tathagatas, Arhats, fully enlightened ones, teach the Dharma to all beings by means of the four forms of questioning and answering. As to the propositions that are set aside as inexplicable, Mahamati, they are made use of by me on some occasions for those whose senses are not yet fully matured. But for those of matured senses, there is nothing to set aside. Further, Mahamati, all beings being devoid of doing and doer are unborn. As there is no doer, all things are therefore said to be unborn. Mahamati, all things are without self-nature. Why? Because Mahamati, when they are examined by self-knowledge, there are no such signs obtainable which characterize them with individuality and generality. Therefore, all things are said to have no self-nature. Again, Mahamati, there is no taking birth, no going out. Why? Because Mahamati, the signs of individuality and generality are seen as existing, and yet they are non-existent. They are seen as going out, yet they do not go out. For this reason, Mahamati, all things are neither taking birth, nor are they going out. Again, Mahamati, all things are never annihilated. Why? For this reason, that the individual signs that make up the self-nature of things are non-existent, and all things are beyond reach. Therefore, all things are said never to be annihilated. Again, Mahamati, all things are not eternal. Why? Because the rising of individual signs is characterized with non-eternality. Therefore, all things are said not to be eternal. Again, Mahamati, all things are eternal. Why? Because the rising of individual signs is no rising and is non-existent. And all things are eternal because of their non-eternality. Therefore, Mahamati, all things are said to be eternal. Thus it is said, the four kinds of explanation are direct statement, questioning, discernment, and setting aside, whereby the philosophers are kept away. The Sankhya and the Vaisheshika philosophers teach birth from a being or from a non-being. All that are proclaimed by them are the inexplicables. When the self-nature of all things is examined by knowledge, it is beyond reach. Therefore, they are without self-nature and unattainable. Thus concludes Chapter 2, Part 4 of the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. So that was Chapter 2, Part 4 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. Docs, any thoughts?
This was a difficult one to get through. There were some very interesting bits, and we're going to talk about that when we get there, but it also felt like there was a lot of repetition of stuff we've already seen elsewhere. There's a lot of, you think it's this way because you don't understand mine only, and that's just the end of the line of reasoning. Like, this section was frustrating to get through.
I agree. I have a similar experience when I get through the latter part of Chapter 2 and on into the shorter subsequent chapters, because I think that it just, like you say, restates stuff that we've already seen before, and it also starts to get frustratingly short. I think the Buddha starts to get short with Mahamati in a way that comes off and reads in a very non-charitable way compared to other times we've seen the Buddha interact with people who have these questions and who have what he's decided are these incorrect or inadequate views.
Yeah, it's getting into subjects that are so abstract that it's hard to actually come up with a statement for the Buddha to make other than, no, I'm right. Like, we could talk about it being a matter of the insufficiency of language. We could talk about it as a matter of the limitations of our senses and our interaction with delusion. But it's just, the answers get less and less satisfying as things go on. The explanations explain less. And especially if it continues on this trajectory in later passages, that's a problem.
I think so. And so I'd like to give a little bit of context for why it starts to look like this. You can notice if you're reading along with us that the text starts to come up with these different subjects to talk about. And it's very non-linear, very non-secular type stuff. it jumps around from many different topics, all in rather quick succession. And scholars have noticed that too, and they think that the reason for that is that this is what they call a mosaic text.
Yep.
It's a text that has been composed in many pieces and put all together narratively speaking. So there'll be a passage or a note about non-duality and also one about the three suchnesses, put all together in two very short questions right next to each other. And so it's kind of functioning like a notebook of somebody who's studying or somebody who's very highly advanced, and then it's put into the Buddha's voice retroactively. And so that applies within individual chapters, but also the entire text is sort of composed this way as well. For example, there's an entire chapter which is just a dharani, and that's narratively a part of the sutra if you read the sutra word for word, but historically we know that that dharani exists separately from the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. So why is it in there? There's not really a lot of good concrete answers. It's just a lot of speculation, but it just speaks to the fact that whenever you're thinking about how this text is put together by actual people, you should remember that they are taking notes, taking passages, taking treatises that others have wrote, and they're putting them together narratively in the Buddha's voice to try and compose a text that appears to the reader to be a singular episode between the Buddha and whoever he's speaking to. And that is not always a historical reality.
In previous sutras, we've pointed out specific spots where, like, this is a weird non sequitur topic that kind of pops in the middle and then pops out. And it's like, we talked about those possibly being mosaics at the time, but in this passage, it's starting to be really obvious in a way that really detracts from things as a whole. Whereas when we've noticed that previously, it's been a lot easier to quarantine that mosaic nature into one spot. Whereas here, I can't tell what's the original, what's been added. Like, it's all so mixed up that it seems incoherent.
And I have to give credit to DT Suzuki, even if I have sort of talked down on some of his translation practices before, because tackling a text that is a mosaic like this and does carry so many pieces from so many different sources makes translation a nightmare.
Yeah.
And so to even be able to create something grammatically sensible that's not the original language, especially one language that's so distant from the original Chinese or the original Sanskrit, English, that's an achievement unto itself. And there's ways that it could be better, but you're also sort of locked in with, like, this passage is written in one style and this one's in the next style, and I can't just change styles so radically that it becomes like a different text between this verse and that verse. I have to do something that makes them seem similar and makes them flow together and be coherent, and that is a huge, huge achievement.
Yeah, I remember praising Mr. Suzuki's work in the first episode where we were talking about this, and between now and then we've mostly given him criticism for how his agenda peeks through. But the compliments I gave in the first episode of this still stand. As flawed and as problematic as some of what's going on is, the actual translation part of this, like, I can tell reading the translation that translation process was very difficult. And given how much the text doesn't hang together in its own, it seems like the translation is hanging together fairly well. Now, if I read it in the original language, it might be that I find original was coherent and the translation is where all the problems were, but I don't have the tools to make that assessment. For what I have in front of me, yeah, that the translation part of this seems pretty impressive.
Absolutely. It's a native Japanese speaker translating from his second language, an ancient version of his second language, classical Chinese, into his third language, which is English. And he's making reference of a fourth language, which is Sanskrit, to be able to bring this through. And so, I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, we have a lot of criticisms, but there's praise to be given for Suzuki's work as well.
Absolutely. So let's get into some of the specifics here. Let's start with, on our document, PDF pages 137 through 139. In the book itself, that's 87 through 89. What did you think about that?
So this is where the Buddha is talking about how bodhisattvas are sustained by meditation, basically.
That's right, yeah.
I have a hard time with this section understanding why I should care about this part. This would be extremely important to bodhisattvas. This would be extremely important to people who are approaching that level. But I don't see how understanding the way bodhisattvas are sustained changes my life here in the world where a bodhisattva is a distant thing to venerate. Why is this here? Why is this important?
That's a good question. And I highlighted it because something really, really fascinating to me happens here. The Buddha says that the bodhisattvas are sustained by meditation, yes, their own meditation in their own practice, but specifically in this section, he's describing how they are sustained also by the Buddha's meditation. So, Bodhisattva A is sustained by Buddha X's meditation. How does person A's meditation in any way interact with person B's enlightenment? We've never seen anything like that before. What is the Buddha doing for these bodhisattvas? And how are they bridging that gap? And why aren't they bridging that gap to all sentient beings, for example? Like, if all the Buddhas meditated well enough or hard enough, or if they did something differently, could they, by their meditation, sustain the enlightenment of all sentient beings? They can do it for bodhisattvas, and there's a near infinite number of them. And so, how does this work? What's the actual mechanism from how ex-Buddha's bodhisattva meditation sustains, a bodhisattva's enlightenment? Is this because of non-duality? Is this because of maybe dependent origination? Is this because of suchness being the original cause for the presentation of reality as it is? There's so many different options, and none of them are actually specifically mentioned in this text. And so it's kind of left to interpretation, especially because this kind of concept is not spoken of anywhere in the Theravada or the Mahāyāna texts. It's only spoken of here and in the esoteric sutras. If you'll remember when we were reading the Adamantine Pinnacle Sutra, there were cases where a Buddha or Bodhisattva's presence in the mandala was sustained by the meditation collectively of everyone around them. And that made sense because they were constructing a mind-made realm that is a mandala. But here, is that what's going on? Is this an esoteric thing? It's so hard to see what the answer is. I don't think there is a clear answer given in the sutra. And so it's very fascinating because it's almost like a Pure Land Buddhist mechanism where the compassion and the effort and the meditation of Amida is the reason why we all enter his Pure Land. But the Zen people who will look at this sutra and venerate it, and they will take it very seriously and they'll use it in a very doctrinally important status, they will reject the Pure Land idea that a Buddha's compassion is enough to get you into a Pure Land. They say that you still have to do the bodhisattva thing. You still have to be good. You still have to do all these moral exertions. And how does that jive with this? It's an impossible question. And I just thought it was fascinating because you don't see that anywhere else.
That fascination does not work for me very well because outside of this show, I tend to be working in fantasy scenarios when I'm writing. And when you're talking about a fantasy setting, the idea of somebody's prayers or faith or meditation, like that kind of thing, sustaining someone is not far-fetched at all. There are so many different spots in fantasy where you can see people doing mind-to-mind communication. Like there's a lot of stories where the gods of the given setting are actually sustained by their worshippers' prayers and faith. It's an interesting and unusual idea in the Buddhist context, but I'm generally in that context only for this show. And outside of it, this didn't seem that interesting just because I've seen so many similar things already. So that might be why I'm not connecting with this section as much, because this feels like in a fantasy setting where an author is talking about how magic works in their setting, and it's like, yeah, but who cares? It's magic. There is a point past which explaining how the supernatural powers work feels like fluff, feels like, filler in a way, explaining something that doesn't really need to be explained. Because, I was not at any point curious how bodhisattvas sustain themselves. Given all of the other stuff they can do, that is not that far-fetched to me. But I will say one thing that I came up with while listening, getting into a more Buddhist context. So a bodhisattva is enlightened, and enlightened beings are omniscient. And so among the things enlightened beings would be able to know are the thoughts of others. So if they can know the thoughts of others, they can know the thoughts of a Buddha, and then because the Buddha is, pure skillful means the highest level of enlightenment, etc., listening to those thoughts, being aware of those thoughts, would also reinforce one's own enlightenment. So the Buddha is sustaining other bodhisattvas with his meditation because those bodhisattvas can perceive beyond that the physical signs of that meditation. And beyond that is stuff that they need to be thinking about anyway.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a good theory for how this works. And I think that you might be really onto something there. I can also see and appreciate how this is very fantastical in its theme and its expression. And I agree that it does feel very like Western fantasy novel whenever I'm reading it. But what kind of grabs me about it is this knowledge that for a huge amount of people, this is not fantasy fiction. This is
right.
Like something they believe is real. And I don't believe this is like super real in a very concrete sense.
That's not necessarily literally true, but...
Right. But they believe it, and that's fascinating to me. But I think that you're completely right here, that if you have a bodhisattva perspective of a Buddha or Buddhahood in general, you're going to see something different than average mundane people like you and I are going to see. And in seeing that and in perceiving that, Buddhas have to project something different, something higher, something more, in order to sustain those people's meditation, in order to lead them by example. When you're leading regular, normal people by example, then you might just practice and preach like the Buddha does in the sutras we have. But whenever you're leading bodhisattvas by example, you have to do something different. You have to do something that seems fantastical to the regular guy. And I think that that is a good way to explain what's happening. So if you're ready, let's move on to the next section, 140 through 142.
So this is a section where Mahamati is bringing up what he sees as a flaw in the story that the Buddha is telling. Basically saying that the philosophers argue that there is a beginning point, whereas you are arguing that there is no origin point, there is no single spot where things started. Everything is caused by a previous cause, which was caused by a previous cause, etc. And Mahamati talks about this as like, hey, the philosophers kind of have a point here. A singular beginning point is more sensible and less complicated than what you're proposing. Have that framing more or less right?
Yeah, he says that their presentation is more simple, and also he says that whenever you're discounting them, you're using the same terminology, but you seem to be using it with the intent of using it with a different meaning. How does that work, right? That's kind of what Mahamati is about in this section.
And I think that's a fair question and a good question. I could think of a few ways that we've seen in other sutras where the Buddha could make an actual attack on that. For example, he could talk about how there's a cause beyond that supposed original cause that we can't perceive. So the problem there is the limitations of our senses. He could be like, wait, how is that simpler? How is a single starting point better than there not being a single starting point? Like, that is a presumption that Mahamati is making here that I don't think is a fair one. I would expect previous versions of the Buddha that we've seen in other sutras to attack from that direction. What we have in this direction, however, is basically the Buddha saying that I see it better than you do, trust me. His answer is a non-answer in a way that I find really frustrating, especially for such an interesting question.
I agree. I think that there is So it's complicated because I think that there's a performative aspect to this dialogue. In my head, I believe that it must be true in text, in a diegetic sense, that Mahamati is having this conversation knowing most of what the Buddha is going to say because he's trying to sort of perform this dialogue Socratically for the audience, right? So we are being spoken to with the answers, and Mahamati is feeding the questions that he probably also already knows answers to. And so that's something that's very common, and that's a theory that scholars have when interpreting and analyzing all sutras that have interlocutors like that. We are led to believe that the Buddha is having somewhat prescribed or ritualized dialogues, either with Mahamati in this case or with Ananda in other cases. And this won't be the first time that whoever is listening has ever heard this, but it will be the first time for us, the readers, or the audience in attendance witnessing this dialogue. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a performance, but in the case of this section in particular, it's like you already know the answer, or you should already know the answer. Talking to Mahamati directly, it sort of breaks that performative pattern, and it says, you should know this, or it says, I know this, and you just have to trust that I know this. And I fail to grab onto it as well. I fail to be able to unpack a lot from what the Buddha says in response to Mahamati.
If it's a performative thing, I could very easily believe that skillful means is a thing. We've seen other sutras where the questioner will ask something that the questioner should already know by the context of the story and the like. And that's there to kind of do what I do on the show, on the regular episodes for the audience, just set the expert up to be the expert. And so if that performative aspect is going on here, what I would say is that Mahamati performs his role well, and the Buddha fails to deliver in this question, because the answer doesn't actually answer any questions for me. The end point is take it on faith, trust me. If I were looking at a being who could do all of the things that the Buddha can do, I would be willing to do that trust. I would be that trusting. But right now I'm looking at words on a page, and that is not enough for me to trust. So
the Buddha usually explains things and uses words and distinctions very skillfully, and this is a place where he doesn't do that. Skillful means fails him right now, because there's plenty of other examples where we see the Buddha and who he's talking to have conversations like, okay, well, you said faith or trust. Explain that. Or you said, I know this in my head, you should know it in yours. Explain what? And there's clarifying questions, and he explains well. But in this case, none of that happens, and it's sort of uniquely complicated and uniquely opaque in that way.
And that gets even more frustrating in the next section. So for what we were just talking about, Mahamati starts with a good question that the Buddha brushes aside. And then next we see Mahamati asking, frankly, a really stupid question, talking about how reality is reified by the words. The words are a true thing, or something like that. And that's not how things work. I can tell you that an orange is blue, as in the fruit orange is a blue thing, but it's still going to be orange. The words don't change the physical reality of the world they're in, and trying to use that to find an anchor point for reality is dumb. That's not something that I would think of somebody who has really thought about these kind of things to misunderstand. This question doesn't need the Buddha to slap it down. Anyone can do that. And he does slap it down, but this is a spot where the idiot ball gets passed to Mahamati instead, and just really annoying.
Yeah, it's how is Mahamati a bodhisattva mahasattva if he's going to ask the Buddha, Blessed One, is it not because of the reality of words that all things are? If not for words, Blessed One, there will be no rising of things. Hence, the existence of all things is by reason of the reality of words. I mean, that's not right. And I can see what he's speaking to. There might be this vaguely Cartesian sounding idea out there among other people who the Buddha discounts as wrong, thinking that, okay, well, maybe language is not descriptive, maybe it's prescriptive, because they don't know their own history. I mean, maybe they think that human language developed first and we spoke existence into existence, right? There may be some wrong philosopher who thinks that way. There may be some guy who believes that, and some followers of him who kind of believe that as well. But that's put directly into Mahamati's mouth. He doesn't say, Blessed One, what do you say about the philosopher over there who says that we speak things into existence, like in the Egyptian myths where the gods, start naming stuff and it starts appearing? No, he says, out of his own mind, is the reality of words the basis of reality itself? And obviously not. And it's not even Buddhist to say that it's not. And it's not even Buddhist to say how it's not the case. Prescriptive versus descriptive. It's just that simple. And that's more or less what the Buddha says in response, right? I mean, that's kind of an easy smackdown. It's such a non sequitur and such a hard transition from what was previously a very good question that it just speaks to the fact that this is a mosaic text and it will do frustrating stuff like that further as we continue to read it.
It does have a few interesting things to talk about, though. And so in the next section, we talk about the nature of delusion.
For those reading along with us, this is page 144 or 45 of a PDF, 94 through 95, native to the book itself.
So we're talking about the nature of delusion, if it's a thing that can be fully cleansed, if it's subject to impermanence and emptiness and the like. And the Buddha's answer here is actually pretty interesting to me, because the answer is no, delusion is not subject to impermanence. And it's a similar reason for why impermanence isn't subject to impermanence. It's part of the Dharma. It's something either outside of or underneath or more fundamental to the world than the things delusion affects. So delusion is not the evil part. It's not the part that causes negative consequences. It's the attachment that arises from the delusion. So that's an interesting way to reframe things, and it actually holds up pretty well, I think, to other things that we have seen in the texts. So, here's the spot where I'm thinking this part really does add something.
I agree. I like this section a lot, too. It's kind of following a theme that we've seen in other bits where the Buddha is describing all things as being Maya-like. And the word Maya is like dreamlike or like a mirage. And, we've had this whole complicated passage a couple episodes ago about a hare's horns or a tortoise's hair or a barren woman's child. These are things that neither exist nor not exist. And this is a case where delusion is very similar. From one perspective, yeah, delusion exists because people are deluded. They have a deluded view about reality according to the Buddhist context. However, it doesn't exist in the sense that it's a small d dharma that's subject to impermanence, emptiness, or dukkha, right? Delusion is not subject to those things because it's a characteristic, it's a descriptor, it's not a tangible thing in reality. It's a state rather than a statement or a thing, right? And so for that reason, just like impermanence is not empty, just like emptiness is not impermanent, it's also not subject to impermanence, emptiness, and dukkha. However, as the Buddha says, and as you mentioned, it is potentially the cause for a lot of delusion and a lot of attachment and a lot of dukkha, right? So delusion itself is a cause for karmically bad things, potentially, but it itself is karmically neutral. And it's a matter of reorienting ourselves to sort of purify our karmic bads, to undo delusion and shift that state to one of enlightenment. In that regard, it's different in status from maybe the cup in front of you, right, which is eventually going to crumble and reform and change into something else due to impermanence, and which also has no core self-existence due to emptiness, and which might be subject to dukkha because you might want the cup to last longer than it does, but it won't, right? Delusion is very different in status from that stuff.
It's also, delusion can be the cause for a lot of negative karma, but delusion itself is a neutral force. somebody could be deluded into doing something that's actually karmically positive. If you believe that eating animals is wrong for some reason other than what Buddhism describes, but it still leads you to not eat meat, that's still positive karma, even though it comes from a root of delusion. Now, obviously, in the Buddhist sense, being a vegetarian for the correct reasons is better, but it's still a way to demonstrate that delusion is not the problem, it's the result that comes out of it.
It's like walking around sort of blindly, right? Some of the time you will do things right, and some of the time you'll do things wrong. But the blindness is not sort of factoring in on whether the thing that you do is right or wrong. It's you want to do away with the blindness altogether, if possible, so that you sort of have control, right? Delusion is sort of a state of lack of knowledge and therefore a lack of control over what X, Y, or Z action means, what it means morally, and how it affects sort of you and those around you. It's like a blind misunderstanding. That's why ignorance and delusion are often used interchangeably whenever we're talking about this stuff in English, because they're both sort of states of darkness to be contrasted with states of enlightenment, right? That's why enlightenment has this connotation of light. The opposite state is groping around in the darkness, hoping that something works, or coming up with incorrect reasons or incorrect logics for how stuff works, or if it does work at all. And so, yeah, in that way, the darkness itself is neutral and enlightenment itself is neutral, but there are lots of good reasons why you would want to go from one to the other.
All right. So after that, we get a section where the Buddha talks about some theory of language, basically. We get words and objects having a name body, sentence body, and syllable body. So I took a crack at actually interpreting these and got 2 out of the 3 right. So the name body is the thing, the small d dharma that a given word indicates. The sentence body, which I got incorrectly the first time, is basically the meaning of the given symbol. And then the syllable body is either the sound of the word or the shape of the symbol, like the actual mark that indicates a given thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is very interesting doctrine of language, which has several layers of interpretation. So the first layer, a name body, like you say, is the referent of a name. There's the word cup, and then there's the object cup. And then the sentence body is the meaning or the referent of the sentence. So the sentence, the dog is running, has a reference, a running dog, right? The real actual dog that's running. It's similar to the name body in that way, but it's just a full sentence. It implies more than just single noun and implies, noun doing action. And then there's the syllable body, like you say, the sound of the syllable we make, like ah, for example, or the mark, like the letter A, to denote ah. That's like the lowest level interpretation. But then if you go to a higher, more esoteric level of interpretation, these things get a little bit more complicated and they have a little bit more sort of cosmology attached to them. So relevant to the question that Mahamati asked, which we thought was stupid earlier, are words sort of before or after reality? Are they prescriptive or descriptive? A name body, the body of the word cup, is the referent. That's the body, the physical sort of manifestation, the physical substance of that word. Also, when it comes to sentence body, it's the physical completion of the meaning of the sentence, right? A dog actually running completes the meaning of the sentence, there's a dog running. And so in that way, that sentence has a physical mark, a physical remain on the universe. And then syllable body has somaticity or physicality in the sound itself. And this gets into esoteric stuff because we've talked about how the ah syllable is the sort of primordial symbol, and it sort of preludes all things existing in their various forms, because it's sort of like the core original central vibration that all things sort of exist dependent upon. And so in that regard, sound also has a very physical sort of mark on reality. And that mark is karmic in some way. It can be karmically good, bad, or neutral. And that mark also is a cause and condition for other things, right? So sound leaves a mark. Even though its vibration of air particles we know due to modern science, it sort of leaves a permanence. And that's why mantras and spells and dharanis work. They are pure sounds. They are karmically good sounds that create karmically good causes and conditions. And so there's the esoteric side of that as well.
Yeah. After that section, we get to the Buddha talking about the way he teaches and various discussions of non-duality that are contradicting each other. They're implying that the Buddha is saying untrue or incomplete things as a mercy to people who can't handle the whole thing. Like, it's hard to pull out an actual meaning here because he goes back on everything he says in the next sentence.
Exactly. So the section we're talking about is page 99, native to the book, or 149 if you're looking at a PDF. He's saying that there is this group of inexplicable statements that philosophers make, and it doesn't matter what they are for our purposes. He's saying he doesn't use inexplicable statements when he's teaching. Inexplicable statements make use of false, made-up, contrived, constructed discriminations, distinctions between X and Y. We get this in the formula that we've seen all over the place in this sutra, like existence and non-existence, being and non-being, etc. And he says, in my teaching, Mahamati, discrimination does not take place, because I teach to stand above grasped and grasping. So this is like a clear presentation of non-duality, right? But then later, in the same paragraph, on the same page, he says, Mahamati, they, meaning inexplicable statements with distinction and discriminations, are used by me on some other occasions for those whose senses are not yet fully matured. This is a huge problem because the stakes are that the Buddha claims that inexplicable statements and teachings in terms of duality and discrimination do not lead to enlightenment, but at the same time, he teaches that way to certain people. So is he teaching them dead-end pathways? Is he teaching them on dead-end terms? We can assume here that he's speaking about the Shravakas and the Pratyeka Buddhas. He teaches the right teaching to the Bodhisattvas because they're the best. They always have been. That's what Mahāyāna thinks. And he teaches the wrong way to the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas because he says, of course, that's all that they can understand. But if he's teaching them on dead-end terms, then how can they ever rise above the station of Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha and become a Bodhisattva? How can they ever get out of their wheel spinning that he says that they're doing all the time? This is huge. I think that this speaks to an inherent contradiction that takes place in the interdenominational sniping that we see going on in Buddhism. Constantly saying that the Theravada people are wasting their time and that they don't get it is implying that the Buddha willingly told them false stuff or that he failed them in some way because he openly admits to teaching differently to them. It's like saying, I teach calculus to this guys, but I only teach addition to these guys. And then saying, well, these guys can't do multiplication, so they will always fail at math no matter what. The texts try to imply that this is part of a linear advancement of teachings, and that Theravada people are just stuck at the lower level of teaching than the Bodhisattvas. But again, that doesn't really hold up to the idea that the Buddha has only ever taught one internally coherent and non-contradictory dharma, and it also implies that he taught sort of falsely on purpose to them. Did he actually do that? That's a huge question that I don't think is ever really resolved.
Yeah, sections like this is part of why I think I have this impression of the Buddha being a different character than the one we've talked about before. Like, it doesn't match in a way that is really frustrating and adds nothing that I can see other than confusion. And like, there are aspects of the sutras that are aiming for confusion, but this doesn't seem to be one. This just seems to be bragging about how awesome this path is and how lame the other one is. And I'll also say he's talking about he doesn't make inexplicable statements as part of his teaching, and like, yes, he does. By the meanings of the words inexplicable, relative to the readers, the people actually consuming this, these statements often are inexplicable. This whole section falls apart on every level.
Yeah, and there's an argument to be made that whenever this section uses the word inexplicable, that's a translation choice because it refers to a group of statements that philosophers make or that Brahmanical teachers make, like I mentioned in previous episodes. But he uses it over and over again to the point where we're led to believe that he doesn't mean, capital T, capital I, the inexplicables, referring to those statements, which have a corresponding Sanskrit term. He's actually just talking about a statement that you can't explain, a statement that seems contradictory based on the meanings of the words in it. And I think that in a very concrete sense, it does fall apart on a level of the inexplicable nature of how the Buddha teaches sometimes, because that fits with the definition of inexplicable. There's statements given and claims made that simply cannot be explained in a way that makes sense in any language, not just English, but also Sanskrit, classical Chinese, Japanese, what have you. And on a lot of occasions, that's on purpose, and on a lot of occasions, that's actually okay. It's supposed to sort of make you think and consider. It's supposed to be a skillful means. But he claims here that he doesn't ever do it. And that's just false. That's just completely false. And I think that there being a translation issue does not take away from the fact that this contradicts stuff that we've seen tons and tons of times before.
I've got nothing else there, so let's talk about eternality for a bit.
Yeah, so in this next section, on page 100, 150 of the PDF, there's this dialogue about eternality and relativity and inclusivity and these big scary terms that I think that Buddhism engages with pretty frequently and that the Buddha has spoken on a great deal. And there's a dialogue between him and Mahamati dealing with eternality and what that actually means and what it applies to. And there's a paragraph at the top of page 100 where linguistically he examines the way in which all things are said to be eternal. And that completely contradicts impermanence, right? How could it not? Well, there's something to be mindful of here. This statement on 100 says, quote, "Therefore, Mahamati, all things are said to be eternal, thus it is said," and then he gives a verse about how things are eternal. And so it's a bit of a linguistic trap, and in that way it's kind of a translational trap as well. He is speaking of how impermanent things, their impermanence is permanent. He's speaking of how the Dharma is permanent. He's speaking of how the Dharma is not empty. It's not part of what is referred to by impermanence, emptiness, and so on. This is like what we were talking about before, whenever we were, talking about name, body, syllable, body, and when we were talking about other aspects of the Dharma that are not subject to sort of the Dharma itself. And so here, we're talking about eternality, not for quote-unquote all things in the conventional sense. We're talking about eternality for emptiness, for impermanence, and for sort of things as they present to us from this mind-only doctrine perspective. So keep that in mind as you're reading. You're supposed to walk away from this understanding that there's like the enlightened side of things, the enlightened character of things, or how you would perceive things according to an enlightened point of view. That stuff is eternal. But the stuff that presents itself to us in our everyday deluded sort of situation, that stuff is subject to impermanence, emptiness, and so on. However, this is just an interesting convergence point because another school of Buddhism, which develops early on in Mahāyāna's history, called Sarvastivada, actually does believe that all small d dharmas are eternal. So it's one of the few Buddhist schools that, I think it's the only Buddhist school actually, that sort of rejects impermanence for that which impermanence refers to in almost every other case. So they believe that all small d experiences, phenomenon, all things captured by small d dharma, these things are actually permanent, everlasting, eternal, but they still don't have a self. So how does that work, right? Very complicated doctrine that I'm sure that we'll talk about at another time. But just know that two different kinds of Buddhists are looking at that statement, thus all things are said to be eternal, and they're getting two very different things out of it.
It definitely did not come across as I was reading it here and now as an outsider, because this section, I kind of glossed over it in my head because it seems so on the face level incompatible with impermanence. So I don't know if this is a problem with the original writing, the translation. This might be a problem with me. But something in here did not convey in a way that made me discount this set of pages.
No, yeah, exactly. And it originally did that for me, but I had to, when I read this before this series on the sutra, I had to get extra context to figure out what it is. And it's all of these things. It's a translation issue because eternality implies sort of the existence of selfhood and basically the opposite of impermanence. And it also, this conversation is taking place in a hypothetical realm, so to speak, where basically he's having a linguistic debate through Mahamati with these people called the philosophers. So the philosophers Mahamati is saying are talking about eternality and non-eternality, and what does the Buddha have to say about this stuff? And what he has said before, and what he really wants to say is, I don't talk about stuff in those terms, because that's stupid, that's dualistic, that's a failure to understand mind only, etc. But he goes through it here in great detail, and he actually says, okay, if you want to talk in terms of non-eternality and eternality, then the name body and the sentence body and the syllable body, yeah, those actual bodies are impermanent, but the characteristics of the name body, syllable body, sentence body, those things are eternal. And those characteristics are this, and this. And that's just missing from here. We're just supposed to sort of know going into this that that's the realm in which they're talking. And yeah, it doesn't come through. I think it's poor practice if you're talking hypothetically, if you're talking about, these terms, to kind of go into them and say stuff that's at its face contradictory whenever you're really trying to sort of deal in a very specific doctrinal linguistic situation.
Yeah, this section does not do what I think it wanted to do at all. To me. That's not the first time this has happened on this show. It probably won't be the last. It's still frustrating because, it is unlike what we have seen before in a way that sticks out, and it's conveyed poorly enough here that, it damages my opinion of the rest of the text.
Yeah, I sort of agree. I think that it is, of all the sutras we've read, this one is pretty slapdash. This one is pretty sort of slapped together and not really narratively coherent, and it deals with hypotheticals to a point where it's easy to misinterpret and say the Buddha is contradicting himself when really he's speaking to a hypothetical that is missed in the text and is missed in sort of how Mahamati presents the question and how the Buddha presents the answer. And I think that all in all, when it comes to doubting the canonicity of this text, as many Theravada and many other schools of Buddhism do, those who look upon Mahāyāna canon as not being canon, I think that this one presents an easy example because we've already knocked over the fact that the Buddha dies. So just like the Lotus Sutra, he said earlier that he doesn't die. And we've already gotten real deep into this mind-only stuff, which is, we've talked about how it's not Cartesian idealism, but it can read that way sometimes. Theravada Buddhists don't really believe that in a lot of cases. And so there's a lot of stuff in here that would give anti-Mahāyāna thinkers or, Theravada thinkers ammunition to say this is a completely apocryphal text. It's not part of the canon. It's just out there. It was written by some guy in the voice of the Buddha, not an actual sermon given by the Buddha himself.
So that is the end of our discussion for today. This was a frustrating one, but for the sake of completion, we should go through some of the ones that aren't as resonant with us in this day and age. So still valuable to look through, but like I said, I really didn't like this section.
I agree. But we will be finishing chapter 2 pretty soon, and then after that, we're going to set the Lankavatara aside for a moment and jump into some of our first texts that were not purportedly recorded sermons of the Buddha. We'll be jumping into a religious treatise. We haven't decided on one yet, but we'll be jumping into one written by someone who came long after the life of the Buddha and discussing how this person interprets what the Buddha said and what he must have meant, and be discussing how that sort of factors into maybe what Buddhism is all about in a very lived post-Shakyamuni sense. So it does get better. This has been our discussion of Chapter 2, Part 4 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Laṅkāvatāra Sūtra. We hope you enjoyed. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.